Today we are talking with Michael Booth, the author of The Almost Perfect People, The Truth About the Nordic Miracle. Welcome to Redera.
Hi, hello, good to talk to you.
Thank you. It's a fascinating book, even though some people may think it's dry, but the approach that you have, and in bringing out the myths and the miracles and the paradoxes, and of course some of the great successes that those communities have in the region. For the people who may not know much about the region, especially in the United States, would you give them a little bit of overview what the region is and what has been the recent history of the region?
Oh, that's quite a big subject, but well, the book is about Scandinavia, but I also broaden the remit to include the Nordic countries, and so early on I specify that the Nordic definition is Finland, Iceland, and the three Viking countries, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. And I kind of use these terms interchangeably, but if we're being strict about it, Scandinavia is just those three Viking countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway. But in the book, I also broaden out to include Finland and Iceland. And I suppose I think of them as a little bit like a dysfunctional family. They're very closely related in many ways, culturally and politically. And you could look upon them as the Swedes as like the big brother, the Peter Perfect, the head boy. The Danes are the black sheep of the family. They're a little bit party-loving, a little bit more relaxed than the stereotype of Scandinavia. You know, you can buy alcohol here very easily, and they like to smoke a lot of weed and all that kind of stuff. Then you have the Norwegians, who are a little bit like the country cousin, or traditionally were the country cousin. Until they discovered oil in the early 70s, they were quite predominantly rural fishing communities, not particularly prosperous. That's all changed, of course, but still, the rest of Scandinavia holds them as this kind of slightly backward rural group of people. Then you have the Icelanders who left Norway about 1,800 years ago. They were like the renegades who didn't really fit in Norway. They colonized this island in the middle of the North Atlantic, and they are still there today. And they're on the very edge of Scandinavia, literally and kind of spiritually. Fascinating people, the Icelanders. Only about 330,000 of them, so tiny population, but what an impact they have proportionally. And then we have far away on the other side of the region, the Finns, who as a society and a people are balanced very precariously on that east-west border with the Soviet Union, now Russia, of course. And they're a very different type of society, or well, not type of society, but a very different people really to the rest. They're slightly the misfits. They're a bit like the mad auntie in the attic is how I might describe them. So that's the broad overview, but at the heart of it, you have these three former Viking countries, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark.
And obviously Greenland is not part of this, so they are a little bit different than from this group of people.
Well, Greenland is part of this in the sense that it's a dominion of Denmark. It's kind of ruled to an increasingly lesser degree by Copenhagen. They have autonomy in many areas, but yeah, they're part of Denmark technically, but I don't include them in the book. There are only about 60,000 people who live there. It's a whole different subject really, so it's not really included in the remit of the book.
Oh, I understand.
It could have been. If I'd had time and money and another 300 pages, then I would have liked to have included the Greenlanders and also talk more about the Sami people, which are the indigenous people, the nomadic reindeer herders in the north of the region. But I didn't really. I wanted to stick with the core issues in the region, and they were a little bit more on the periphery.
Right. You bring out a plethora of details, economic details, cultural details, and historical traces that are very illuminating to most readers. And the Nordic people in general, and Scandinavian more specifically, are perceived and talked as communities that have reached the point of heightened bliss, as you pointed out in the beginning of the book. What is the fascination of the rest of the world that people, especially the service after service, have come to gravitate to this part of the world?
Well, I mean, the core of it lies in the Danish happiness phenomenon. The Danes regularly top the global happiness surveys and have actually done since the early 70s. I would argue they're not so much happy as content. And they have plenty of reasons to be content, as do the Swedes, Norwegians. These are wealthy people, wealthy countries, among the top 20, top 15 richest countries per capita on Earth. They're free of conflict. They have open democracies. They have higher employment. they are sexy, they don't work very much, and they have a great sense of humor. Why would you not be happy? But I mean, generally, the life satisfaction in all of these countries, all 5 of these countries, is very high. They long ago fulfilled the bottom of the pyramid of Maslow's pyramid of hierarchy of needs. They're just fine tuning the very top of the pyramid right now, and that's fascinating for all of us. I live here, but for all of us who have a grass is greener approach to the world, in the last 10 years especially, the world has started to look towards the north. And my theory is that up until the economic crash in 2008, particularly in Britain and America, our grass was greener in a more kind of Mediterranean sphere. I think when we were all commuting on a Monday morning in the rain and whatever on the train, we would think maybe one day we'll have a life amongst the olive groves or the orange trees, and we'll have a house. I don't know how it was in the States, but in Britain, every TV show, every book, magazine that was coming out was always about buying a house in Spain or France or Italy. Now, we had the economic crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and a lot of people lost a lot of money. A lot of people who moved and tried to achieve that fantasy got bitten very painfully. And I think also the world kind of woke up to wanting a new set of values, craving perhaps a kind of back to basics, a little bit more old-fashioned values of social cohesion, less about acquisition, less about conspicuous consumption, less about globalization. And Norway, Denmark, Sweden had a lot to offer in terms of inspiration about how to live life, about how to structure society in a more fair and equal way. And also, frankly, about how to decorate your home and how to dress a little bit more simply. It had this Scandinavian functional aesthetic that was extremely visually appealing. And I just think a whole load of stars positioned themselves in exactly the right constellation to grab the global imagination about 10 years ago. And this wave, this Scandinavian wave, only seems to be continuing. I don't know if the States, you've had this hygge phenomenon arrive in the States, but it certainly took over in the UK in the last few months. It's this Danish concept of coziness and nesting, I guess you would call it. And the Brits have gone crazy for it. In fact, many countries around the world have been buying books with the word hygge in the title recently. And I think it's all part of this, now more than ever, I think people have a need to, in a way, stick their head in the sand and ignore the terrible things that are happening in the world. And hygge in particular offers a very cozy way of checking out, really, of kind of blocking the world out. And I think there's a danger to that as well, actually.
Talking about the values, their values have been deep-rooted in Lutheranism and also even in the Viking culture. In one way, this is a region seen as a promised land, and it has a deep roots of equality and trust and social cohesion. And at the same time, it also has economic extremism, in which you bring it out quite vividly in Denmark situation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting kind of paradox, isn't it? The happiest people in the world have the highest taxes in the world, but they're also living in the most equal societies, but they also have very large centralized governments, free health care, free education to university. And I've often been asked, what can we learn from these societies? A lot of people want to believe there's a template, right, that you can take from Denmark or Sweden and just apply it to the United States or Britain. Unfortunately, there isn't. As you rightly say, these societies have formed over the last, I would guess, about 150 years since the Industrial Revolution, in a very specific set of circumstances, geographical, even in terms of climate, but also politically. So Sweden is the way Sweden is because of many factors over many decades. And these things happen slowly. So yes, we have a tax level of about 55% here in Denmark, but it wasn't just suddenly imposed. The social system wasn't just suddenly created overnight. It evolved very slowly over decades, particularly accelerating in the 60s and 70s. So it's a bit like, in my book, I think I talk about it as, bringing a frog in water to boil slowly. The frog isn't aware it's being boiled alive. And that's kind of how the Scandinavian tax systems have crept up. It's painful for me to pay my 55% taxes here, of course. No one likes that. But on the other hand, I do gladly pay it because I trust the system that redistributes that wealth. It has a transparency And basically, people here trust their politicians, as amazing as that might sound to Brits and Americans. We trust that the money is going to be redistributed fairly, and we see the tangible benefits in terms of reasonable public transport, reasonable free healthcare, free schooling that is basically equal for all. There's an equal playing field. These are the real lands of opportunity. The American dream doesn't exist in America. It's a fantasy, but it kind of does exist in Scandinavia in the sense that everyone has free access to decent levels of education. And if they want to take that opportunity, they can rise up through, they can exceed the income of their parents. They can go from a lower class kind of background, become professional people. These are the countries where you can move up through the ranks, if you like.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That social economic mobility, which also brings social mobility. But you bring up some very fundamental questions in the book, especially when you start talking about the Gini coefficient and so on. Are fundamentally equal societies better than unequal societies in the long run, or there is such a thing as equal society that only Scandinavians have kind of shown us this is how far humanity can get?
Well, the Scandinavian societies, this Gini coefficient is a measurement of income equality across a society. The gap between the richest and the poorest is the lowest. It's the smallest gap in Sweden and Denmark in particular. Norway's a little bit of an oddity because, as I say, they have this phenomenal oil wealth. But I kind of have come to the conclusion, yes, more equal societies are generally better for everyone. Think, for example, of if you live in South Africa, which is one of the least equal countries in the world. Now, of course, everyone knows being poor is crappy and unpleasant, and no one likes being poor, and it's a grind, and it's stressful, and it's dangerous, and it's deeply problematic in all areas of healthcare and mental well-being and physical well-being in some situations. We know that, that's obvious. But it's also, for a rich person to live in a very unequal society is also stressful and not terribly unpleasant. We think of the rich guy in his bulletproof Mercedes in South Africa living behind a gated community with barbed wire and being fearful of being carjacked. Crime is higher in unequal societies. You have the politics of envy in unequal societies. Even if you're rich and you see there are going to be people who are richer than you, you have the envy gnawing away at you. Generally, inequality is just a bad thing. Now, the big question, and the question, especially from an American perspective, is, so how do we make our society less unequal? And the unpalatable truth is, well, you probably need to tax the rich. There are two ways of doing it, right? You can either tax the rich, or you can give the workers a stake in the means of production, and we all know what that's called and where that ends. So I think it's pretty obvious equal societies are better, but how we get to more equal societies is, of course, the challenge and the controversy.
There are two ways to make societies equal. One, by making the rich less rich, or the second, by making the poor less poor. The American way of thinking is that we don't know. One day we go here, the next day we go completely opposite. But see, the example that you bring up of South Africa, where you're surrounded by poor people, and even if you're afraid of the person around there who might have some criminal intentions or put you in harm or danger. But what about when you see that when the societies are more equal, even rich person cannot get a Mercedes, or the car costs so much that everybody just gives up and uses public transportation only?
Well, they don't, is the answer. There are, I'm looking out of my window now and I can see a very nice Audi convertible across the street. There are Mercedes, there are Rolls Royces even, there are, Danes don't hold back. They want the same things Americans want. And, if they can, then they go and buy them. But you don't see the kind of, if I can say it, the kind of Trumpian excess of wealth. That display to us seems extremely vulgar and counterproductive. You don't see that so much. There are one or two little tiny pockets where you might see it in Stockholm and Copenhagen, but generally these societies are geared, A, towards kind of blocking you off at every pass if you want to achieve that kind of super wealth, and B, if you do, the societies also kind of, in a way, self-censor. People rein it in. They rein in the excess. And a good example of that is, until he died a couple of years ago, the richest man in Denmark, Maersk McKinney Møller, was an oil owned a massive oil company, Maersk, an airline and shipping company, the biggest shipping company in the world, I think. And he was unfathomably wealthy, but he still brought a packed lunch to work every day. He had this very impressive work ethic. In his 90s, he would still climb the 4 flights of stairs to his office rather than take the elevator. And the Danes love that kind of thing. You know, they don't tend to approve. And we have had a few of the hedge funders or the, tech bubble speculators and the slick money guys. There's been a few of them, and generally they've crashed and burned and gone to prison. And the Danes have really relished watching that happen. So, we have this thing called Yanti Law in this part of the world. And Yanti Law was a satire in a 1930s novel satirizing small town Scandinavian mentality. And it listed 10 kind of commandments of if you want to fit in Scandinavia, and they still apply. And they include such things as, you shall not think you're better than us. You shall not think you can teach us anything. You shall not laugh at us. It's all about this. I mean, in the UK and Australia, we have this concept of tall poppy syndrome. If you stick your head above the parapet, if you stand out, you'll get cut down. And to some extent, that still applies, especially once you get out of the capital cities in Scandinavia. Still very much applies. And that helps also rein in the excess, keep things equal.
The Scandinavian countries are known for their easy acceptance and adaptability with the development and acceptance of the new technologies, and they are wealthy. They overcome most of the basic needs that most of the world is still struggling to overcome. When I say most, I mean the large part of the population. What it is about them that they seem to have understanding of not only how to get educated, but also how to apply the education and make it more productive in economic sense. Because in the last few decades, as you bring it out in the book, the productivity growth is not there, and the work ethics are not what they once used to be.
No, I mean, in Denmark, the Danish, if we focus on Denmark, the economy here, they refer to it as the bumblebee economy. In the same way that the bumblebee shouldn't really, according to the laws of physics, be able to stay airborne. So the Danish economy, despite the warnings and the fear of the last maybe 30 years, it's still afloat. It's still a well-functioning society with a low unemployment rate, high per capita GDP. It still functions. And in a sense, it's a kind of a mystery because they don't make so much oil. They don't sell so much oil anymore as they used to. They don't really make very much here. And as you rightly say, their productivity growth is pretty stagnant and has been for the last 15 years. But still, the bumblebee is airborne. I live here in Denmark. It's a wealthy, well-functioning country. Of course, there are problems. You can, fiddle with that point of the pyramid, and people complain about the health service, and I complain about the transport system. But still, I can't think of many countries, if any, that do this stuff better, that function better, that offer a better lifestyle and a better quality of life. And if you talk about that productivity, the first place to look really is probably the number of hours that Danes work. And the truth is, in the OECD countries, they work the fewest hours of any country. On the other hand, they have a really great work-life balance. So, Danes value time with their family. They value leisure time. They don't live to work, they work to live, so to speak, if you put it in a very trite way. So, yes, they're not super productive, but maybe they've just found out a way to reach a plateau and stay there. I mean, I travel a lot in Japan, and I think Japan has maybe found a similar trick in a way, or key, in that their growth, of course, has also been stagnant. But you go there, and generally, people are doing pretty well. It's a well-functioning, pretty wealthy society. Yes, they're not going for growth at all costs like other countries like the UK and America, but they seem to have reached a plateau. They're not declining. They're not increasing. They've reached a happy point of status quo. So maybe we need to reassess elsewhere in the world whether this all expense kind of push for growth doesn't really end happily, does it? Not for people, not for life quality, not for the climate on the planet. This is not good for the planet either.
You bring it out very nicely in the book, is that there is harmony, more harmony than other countries, and also there is better social security in the region. But can the Nordic miracle continue when the public sector keeps growing if population is aging?
Well, that's the $100 million question, and it's something politically in Denmark and Sweden, they have been debating and struggling and fighting over for the last 10 years. And what happens in these countries which you have these kind of multi-party coalitions is things move very slowly and very moderately. So the people who are calling for massive cuts in the public sector don't really get anywhere, but slowly over time they are reining in those public sectors. Sweden in particular has a big problem with its aging population. I think it has the oldest population in Europe, even worse than the Italians. But again, they both of these countries have quite wisely set aside provision for the future. Their pension pots are sound. The state coffers are sound. Finances are all in place and in order looking ahead to the future. They're preparing properly for the future in terms of the aging population. In Sweden, they also have, a different scenario in that they've had mass scale immigration in the last 10 years, which is putting different sorts of challenges, but also bringing different benefits to their economy.
Happiness is all relative. Then how can you be so happy when you're also paying so many taxes? But I guess if you think you're getting better value for your taxes, everyone will be glad to pay.
Yeah, and as I say, I don't think it's about happiness. I think it's about contentedness and life satisfaction. And that comes at a cost. But when people see, as I say, that the money is being redistributed fairly and that they're getting their value for money, and analysis has shown that the majority of Danes, the majority of the population, get more out of their taxes than they put in. And so that's why we have this general feeling of kind of tolerance towards the high taxes. People feel they get their money's worth. I mean, I guess if you're earning $2 million a year, you're going to feel a little bit differently, but still you're living in a society that is safe and well functioning, and where you can walk freely and safely most of the time on most of the streets, which is not the case in the UK or America right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In the three core countries, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, what are the similarities and differences in their attitude to outsiders?
Again, that's a very complicated question. Generally, it seems to be, I don't know why, but the further north you go, the less tolerant people are to diversity. That seems to be a basic rule of thumb. Politically, Sweden traditionally in the last 10, 20 years has been much more open to immigration. The Danes seem to be a step ahead in terms of the right wing. We have this right wing party, the Dansk Folkeparti, which has been particularly anti-Muslim, anti-Islam, has done very well on that agenda in the last 15 years. It now gets around 20-25% of the vote in elections. Sweden, meanwhile, has its own right-wing party, the Sweden Democrats, who have rocketed in popularity again over the last 5 years. Now I think they're polling maybe 17-20%. In Norway, meanwhile, the far right, if you like, or the right-wing party, the anti-immigration party, is actually in government as part of the governing coalition. Meanwhile, in Finland, you also have a right-wing party, the True Finns, I think they're called. And again, their popularity has been a bit more up and down, I think, in recent years. So yeah, but Denmark has had a much more closed-door policy to non-European immigration in the last 10 years. Sweden's had an open door. Norway, an ever-closing door. I guess much more xenophobic than the other two countries, to broadly categorize it.
Why Australia and in many ways New Zealand also, and a few other countries have recognized the value of immigrants beyond Islamophobia? I mean, let's forget the Islam and Muslim situation, but there are a lot of educated people around the world who would do better outside of their country, and today in Canada also welcomes them, and they build their economy using this more sophisticated, educated, advanced people. But I guess the Scandinavians don't see the world that way.
No, they don't. I mean, I would probably argue with you in terms of Australia in that grouping. But if you look at Canada, for sure, Canada seems to be operating a much more tolerant immigration policy. The truth is, in Scandinavia, it is all about Islam, and that blocks out any other consideration. I mean, the immigration policy in Denmark is so ham-fisted and so blinkered and stupid, basically, to be frank, that it's damaging the all-important tech industries and pharmaceutical industries, which is so important to the Danish economy. Those companies, like Novo Nordisk, one of the world's biggest producers of insulin, for example, they struggle to get the skilled workers that they need because of these weird immigration rules in Denmark, especially the repatriation of family member rules are extremely strict. But people it's not just that, but the image of these countries has been so fatally damaged in the last 10 years. In Denmark, we had the Mohammed cartoon crisis, which basically was the worst branding exercise for Denmark in the last, well, ever possibly, in terms of trying to attract non-European, highly skilled workers. They don't want to come here because they don't think they believe they're not welcome, and that's probably true.
This is a society. I mean, when I say society, I mean of the three core countries that are very peaceful. They're very progressive, as you bring it out in the book. They're also very prosperous. They're modern. They're liberal. They're liberated, and they're also best educated and most technologically advanced. And not to mention, they're also, relatively speaking, tolerant too. Why do citizens struggle with alcoholism and depression?
Well, I think there's an alcohol problem across the Western world, isn't there? Across the whole world, I guess. I don't really know why, for example, the Finns especially struggle with alcohol. I'm not sure what the truth of that is. If you look at their per capita consumption of pure alcohol, it's actually average. But all of these countries, all the Nordic countries, apart from Denmark, have very strict government-run monopolies on the sale of alcohol, and they feel that's necessary to prevent society breaking down. I think if they were to de-restrict alcohol sales, there's a genuine fear chaos would reign and people would drink themselves stupid in the street all the time. I don't believe that for a minute, but that seems to be the argument behind these weird monopoly stores. Denmark doesn't have that. This is the country of Carlsberg, right? They like their beer. You can buy alcohol anytime, anywhere, almost. So again, it's a very, when people, part of the reason I wrote the book really was because from the outside, we often lump all of these countries together, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland and Iceland, as one big homogenous group, the Scandinavians. They're not. They're dramatically different. The diversity is as great here as it is in the rest of Europe. So you have very different approaches to alcohol and very different levels of intake of alcohol. And I don't know that it's the worst problem here. If it is, it's probably because the weather's so awful and it's so dark, and the way to get through the winter is just to drink your way through.
You're very well said. The weather does play a big role into this. Now, you do bring out a very nice paradox, or a kind of a conundrum that we still don't know, at least that's how you explained in the book, is that did the trust come first or the social cohesion come first? And what has led to the other? Because the welfare state came much later in the 60s and 70s until the societies became wealthier enough to be able to do that. But is the trust that drives the social capital there that other societies may or may not have, and that creates almost, as you point out, in some cases, 25% of the GDP?
Well, I think, if you're talking about the economic benefit of trust, it's quite interesting because you find that when people in a society trust each other, they don't have need. For example, companies don't need such lengthy contracts. They don't need to involve the lawyers so much. So that saves money right there. I mean, my own personal experience, if I sign a book contract with an American publisher, it's 30 pages long. If I sign a book contract with a Danish publisher, it's 3 pages long, or with a Japanese publisher, it's 3 pages long, because there's a constant fear of litigation and legal action, and you have this huge legal world in the States that sucks so much money out of the economy. So in Denmark, the best example, they used to have the world's leading wind turbine industry, and that grew up in the 70s in a part of Denmark where there was a cluster of companies making these wind turbines, and they all used to share their research and share their innovations with each other. And that led to an immediate and obvious benefit for the Danish economy, because it's now one of the world leaders in wind turbines. That would never have happened in the States, because they would all have to sign non-disclosure agreements, and lawyers would have got involved at every stage. And the similar, I used to live in France, and the French don't tend to trust each other so much. If you enter into an agreement with a French company, you have to assume they're going to try and screw you at some point. So you need to get covered legally. So again, it's cost, it's time, and it's money. Trust also helps an education system, because if the students trust their teacher, they behave better, they take the information at face value, they don't question it so much. And if the teacher trusts the students, then you can get rid of a whole area of the job of teaching that is taken up with lack of trust in other countries. And you see trust has benefits everywhere. It's not just, in Denmark and Sweden, mothers will leave their babies sleeping in prams outside when they go and have a coffee in a cafe or they go shopping. No problem, no worries. You go out in the countryside, a farmer or, a little smallholder will sell some of their fruit and vegetables out on the side of the road, and there'll be an honesty box where you just have to put your money in the box. No, there's no person checking the transaction has gone through. And then at a higher level, if you look at these big tech companies and tech industries in Denmark that Denmark does so well, with the kind of jobs where it's kind of difficult to check on whether your employee is doing what they should do there, maybe, in the fields of research or pharmaceuticals, or generally the more technically demanding jobs where it's impossible to keep an eye on someone and what they're doing and their productivity, trust plays a huge role in that, which is why even German companies like to have bases in Scandinavia, because it's a more trustworthy workforce and they know that they're going to get their money's worth without having to check and audit all the time. So it has very clear economic benefits for a country when everyone trusts each other. And of course, it's very hoogly as well. It's very cozy.
You have traveled many parts of the world. You have been to far corners of the world. What are the striking things that you see in other countries, like maybe Thailand or Africa or in Asia, or that you see that could still benefit the Scandinavian nation?
Well, it all starts, I think, with honest, transparent democracy, and the rule of law. It all comes down to that at the end of the day. If you can get that in place, which is why what's happening in the States is so frightening at the moment, if you can get that in place, other things can follow from that. But without that cornerstone of a judiciary, independent judiciary, a democratic process that functions and is transparent, nothing happens without that in place. And when that's threatened, everything is threatened. So that's the first step, isn't it? Second step when I become president of Earth is a decent level of free education for everyone, irrespective of their parents' income. We have very few fee-paying schools here in Denmark, or at least, the really expensive ones like we have in the UK. And it's no coincidence that we don't have that, and yet we have very equal, effectively classless societies. The two go hand in hand, as far as I'm concerned. That equality of opportunity is the other fundamental. And from everything else, from that, everything else comes, it seems to me. So if I were to become president of Zimbabwe tomorrow, I think that they would be the first things on the agenda.
But if everybody is equal and everybody has equal opportunity, what happens to the high achievers? Do they brain drain to London?
There's no clear answer on that. I mean, empirical observation suggests a lot of Danes in their 20s, particularly in early 30s, they do go to London and to a lesser extent to New York to gain experience, in more challenging work environments, to gain skills, to earn money, have a great life. But it seems to be they come back to Scandinavia when it's time to breed, when they're going to have kids, and they value the support structure and the society for that much more here. I think Denmark, for example, is maybe one of the best countries in the world to raise kids in. Everything is geared towards the families, geared towards safety and equality of kids in the law, and things just function really, really well for kids here. So in terms of brain drain, I'm not so sure that actually happens. I'm not. I mean, yeah, sure, but in the younger years, and then they come back here.
As you point out in the book and in our discussion, is that the contentment rather than happiness, before the advent or before the societies became wealthier in those three core countries, before the welfare state was in place, were the Danes just as content as they are today in the 40s, 20s, and 30s?
Well, there's not very much evidence of this because people didn't start asking about happiness until the early 70s. But I did find some quite enlightening historical records from foreigners, like foreign ambassadors to Copenhagen in the 18th century and 19th century. And they do seem to describe the Danes as they are today, as this kind of relatively happy, satisfied, maybe a little bit self-satisfied people. So it's quite. I suspect. I don't know, but I think they've always been relatively even-keeled. Maybe the Lutheranism has a lot to do with that, because Lutheranism is all about things in moderation and tempering one's appetites and one's excesses. So maybe over the last 600 years, that has been the main factor in bringing this balance and equilibrium to these societies. I'm not sure. Some people claim it goes all the way back to the Vikings, but I kind of think that's a nonsense. The Vikings also had their kings and had their hierarchies, and they were very violent and unpleasant people as well, you know. So it seems odd to me that modern day Danes would cherry pick some qualities and not others. But I think Lutheranism has much more to do with it.
Mm-hmm. We have been speaking with Michael Booth, the author of The Almost Perfect People, The Truth About the Nordic Miracle. Give us a little bit background about you and how did you end up in Denmark and what brought you to writing?
Well, I ended up in Denmark as most foreigners, many foreigners used to, is I married a Dane. Rather like the Vikings did 1,000 years ago. She sailed across the Atlantic, the North Sea, and dragged me back to live in Denmark by the hair. And before that, I barely knew anything about Scandinavia. This was about 15 years ago, but I have learned a lot since then. So that's why I'm here. And initially, when I came here, I didn't like it very much. I found this Yanti Law that we talked about earlier very suffocating. I found it very boring. This is the downside, the often unspoken downside of these equal, satisfied, successful, wealthy countries. They tend to be very homogenous, and that can be extremely boring. And I found it very boring and suffocating. Now then, we have kids, and as I said earlier, I came to appreciate what a great country this is to raise children in. And the older I get, the more I appreciate it. And now I live here, almost of my own free will, basically. I don't think I'm going to live here for the rest of my life, but, for the next couple of years at least. And in terms of being a writer, well, I worked in television after I left university. I hated it. I ran away to Bangkok. I found an English language magazine in Bangkok, rang them up one day and said, can I come and write for you? And they were very open to that idea, and I started writing there. Went back to the UK, did a journalism postgraduate course, started off as a freelancer straight away, and have not looked back since. My background really is in journalism.
And you went to Bangkok from England, I guess.
That's right, yeah.
Obviously, you have historical and cultural roots in England. Where do you see the similarities and differences between England and the Scandinavian? Now, Scandinavian is not the right term, but maybe in Denmark or...
Yeah, I actually think that the Danes and the Brits have a lot more in common than the Brits and the Germans and the Brits and the French. Similar sense of humor, similar sense of justice and fairness and democracy, similar work ethic, I guess, for broadly speaking, all that, the whole nonsense about Protestant work ethic versus, I'm a Catholic actually, but I think that's a lot of nonsense. But a similar kind of approach to maybe a lack of romance, a little bit, a lack of poetry that you maybe get in Southern Europe, bad dress sense. I don't know. There are similarities. I certainly think, apart from the language, Denmark is one of the closest societies I could have gone to from the UK.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for your time and comments, and please do keep us in mind if you do come up with another book that is just as interesting to read.
Oh, you're so welcome. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.